Well, welcome back to It's an Inside Job podcast. I'm your host, Jason Lim. Now, this podcast is dedicated to helping you to help yourself and others to become more mentally and emotionally resilient so you can be better at bouncing back from life's inevitable setbacks. Now, on It's an Inside Job, we decode the science and stories of resilience into practical advice, skills, and strategies that you can use to impact your life and those around you. Now, with that said, let's slip into the stream. Well, welcome back to It's an Inside Job. I hope you've all had a relaxing and rejuvenating weekend. This week, I am privileged to be joined by Alan Lefevre. He is the HR director for Doctors Without Borders in Norway, and he's dedicated his life to helping others. With over 30 deployments in natural disasters, outbreaks, and armed conflict contexts, Alan has seen it all. However, after becoming a father of twin boys, Alan shifted his focus to mentoring and coaching others in the field. During our conversation, I was struck by his incredible humility and empathy towards others. Despite his extensive experience and knowledge, he spoke with a genuine desire to connect and help others, making our discussion all the more enlightening and inspiring. And wherever you are and whatever you may be doing at this moment as you listen to this episode, I hope it broadens your perspective of humanity, of this message, this story we talk about, resilience, and how it shows up. Because like many of you, my life is kind of it's a slice of seeing the world. It's my day-to-day. And pretty much it's very similar. But when I talk to professionals such as Alan, it's completely broadens my experience. It broadens my perceptions and perspective. And so, without further ado, let's slip into the stream and meet Alan Lefevre. Well, welcome to the show, Alan. I appreciate your time. I was wondering if we could begin the conversation by you introducing yourself and what you do.
Yes, so my name is Alan Lefevre. I am French by nationality. I'm now living in Norway, and this since 2010. Before that, I've studied different things, languages, business, geopolitics, and I started as a humanitarian worker quite early. It became an objective early. I worked first with street kids in Indonesia. That was part of my study, actually. But my first deployment was in Liberia in 2004, in post-conflict area. Then I was deployed on the famous tsunami in 2004-2005 in Indonesia. That was not with Doctors Without Borders at the time. It was with another type of organization. And I continued. I mostly worked for what we called emergency teams. I started as a logistician, and then I became rapidly a team leader, deployed to do assessment in different type of contexts, natural disaster, conflict areas, outbreaks like cholera, Ebola, and so on. So I've been deployed more than 30 times up until 2011, if I remember well. And I ended up a bit tired, I must say, at that time. It was, I remember one year where I did 7 deployments in 1 year. So it was a lot of traveling, intense life.
And how long was the average deployment?
Some of the deployment were short. In an emergency situation, life-saving will be for 1 week to 2 weeks. But my assignment would be 2 months. But 2 months means 7 days a week.
Yeah.
Time without days off and quite long days. My longest assignment, I think, was 5 months, but it was not an emergency. It was a post-emergency. So yeah, some of those were quick, were quite short. I did one assessment in a conflict area in Philippines. It was 1 month. So yeah, there's a variety. But I was very linked to my placement in MSF, really part of the team that would be deployed in response to emergency. Other deployment in Doctors Without Borders can be 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. But me, I was really dedicated to emergencies. And then decided to take a break. I was tired, I think, physically, mentally. And I had met my partner, who I'm still with today. And so I decided to take a break. And in 2012, I started to build mentoring and coaching initiative for MSF, already at a global level. And I did that until 2020. And for the last 3 years, I started on the exact day of the lockdown of COVID-19 in Norway. I became the HR director for MSF Norway. So that's what I'm doing now for the past 3 years.
Thank you for that introduction, Alan. I'm curious, what inspired you to work in these hazard areas, in these emergency response areas? You know, when you first began, maybe it wasn't with Doctors Without Borders, as you said, but with organizations to go out there and help people.
Yeah, I think the plan originally was not to end up in this intense situation. The idea when I did my studies, I have one experience that I remember well. So I was studying business and I was studying languages for business. And strangely enough, I chose at that time to learn Indonesian. So I was studying business, learning Indonesian. I had the opportunity to study in an Indonesian university in Bandung. And I came to realize, it was strange, that maybe I was not done for doing business. The shock was, I think I was living and studying in Indonesia a few years after the major economic crisis in that rocked the whole Southeast Asia. And I think I got the shock. I still have that picture of two street kids without barely clothes on themselves, begging with a McDonald's cup to get the money in front of, at the time, I'm sure it's not the case today, at the time, the most corrupted bank in Indonesia. So I have this kind of picture as a shock of these two kids malnourished and begging for money. So that there's been a process, basically, thinking, no, I'm not going to do business. I'm going to do something else. Maybe I wasn't sure what at the time, but it helped me to reorientate my studies, because after I studied geopolitics, I then did a master in humanitarian studies. So that was the start, basically. But I had no profession. I was not, my master was very general. So I remember applying at Doctors Without Borders, and they said, well, you have an interesting CV, but you have no profession, no skills to bring. So go out there, get some work experience and come back, which I did. I did find a job in Paris, in logistic and supply, and then came back later. So it's then starting that I found out that it was my place to be specifically in emergency situation But you would have told me 15 years ago I would have been in a war zone like in Misrata during the Libyan conflict, surrounded by the Gaddafi troops. I would have said no way.
How old were you at the time when you were, for example, in Libya?
In Libya was 2011. I was, good question, 35, 36, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in these conflict zones, in these emergency zones where you were obviously to some extent risking life and limb to help others, to help other communities, to help other cultures, what did you learn about yourself?
That's a good one. It's strange because it's always been, it always took me quite a few years to get the learning, and you're kind of in a bubble when you travel to, when the flying is to Libya, for example. You're in a sluice, literally. You try to get prepared, but you don't know what you're going to end up with. There is a bit of fear. There's a bit of anxiety, of course. And then you arrive there, you just adapt, you learn quickly, you pause, and then you come back home. And then, that's the moment I think the fact that you realize you managed, I was about to say you came back alive. No, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but I think you learn more about yourself for everything you've learned from the others. I think when I've learned in Libya, that's one experience, but I've also been in Mogadishu during a tense period, is you learn more about the others, I think. I don't know if it's answering the question. I think if I take the case of Libya and Mogadishu, learning about the resilience of others is quite instructive. More humility, more humility when you come back. Like, okay, I go back to my comfort at home and security or job or health access, and then that's the thing, I think. Yeah.
You know, what I've heard from other people when they come back to the West, come back to their safe zone, their safe home and such, it's also an appreciation how the culture that they're coming back has built, that it's not just built on one or two people, but it takes a whole culture to build that safety, to build that infrastructure, and to actually you're sometimes humbled, I think, as you said, because you appreciate and you become very grateful of the previous generations, whether it's in France or Canada or Norway, and how they've built that safety, that mechanism, because it's not just a flip of a switch. This is over generations to create this. And then there's the other side of the fence. It sounds like when you were in those zones, such as in Somalia or Libya, that you saw the resilience of people who don't have the necessities and luxuries that we have in the West, but that somehow they find resilience. I was wondering, could you speak to that side of how you saw resilience showing up with these people, these people in these war zones, in these conflict zones, or just these natural disaster zones?
Yeah, I think everything in their context in their life becomes so limited. Everything that they come, I think, to appreciate the very little they have. Whether it's about their relatives, their family, if they've lost children or family members, they've lost their house, they've lost everything. The very little they have, they value it a lot. I've always been kind of shocked by the smiles and the happiness of kids who literally have 1% of what my kids have. And I'm not saying they're happy in general, but they're smiling. And anything they can have in their hand, they will make a toy out of it, and they will just enjoy it. So I want to be careful. I'm not saying, they're not happy as such, but they just experience things in a much more simple way. Mm-hmm. They value the simple things that they can have, and they just take it as it is. So what is striking also is they have no choice to connect and collaborate to survive. The famous fight, flight, or freeze. I mean, they have to. That's the moment. What I've seen in Libya and many other contexts, how suddenly people forget about some conflict, about some issues, because their survival is about collaborating with others. It's about helping each other. Every time I've seen people organizing themselves, Libya was shot. I mean, the city was surrounded. The city of Misrata was surrounded. And I had been in conflict area before, but what they achieved to defend themselves, to survive, to help each other I had never seen such a thing. I think it would be interesting for other communities and societies to look at that. But again, they didn't have any choices. They had to create such a system of those making the breads, those organizing transport, those taking care in the hospital. I mean, it was just insane. It was just insane.
So if I understand you correctly, Alan, are you saying when there's an outside threat, whether that be a natural disaster or soldiers knocking on the city walls kind of thing, about to invade, what it does, that common threat, it binds people, creates a cohesiveness and a collaboration that kind of naturally comes out, a sense of stronger community? Is that what I understand you're saying?
Exactly. And the first reflection on that is, I think we're losing that in some of our developed societies. We're losing that kind of reflex because we have everything. And then I think the way we connect and collaborate in rich countries is changing because of that. Definitely.
Well, just to come back to that collaboration, how it melds people, it tightens people's community to help each other and collaborate.
Mm-hmm.
I've been talking to many Ukrainians in different cities,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just the same thing. They are under attack, and it's just they're feeling this anger and this. They're at the same time this hope, but they are tired. But there's still this faith to push through, and it's creating tighter bonds. It's actually the external threat has vaporized all the vacuous values, and people have come down to the grounded, hardcore values that pull us together, that make us human. It was stripped. I remember my grandfather, I'm half British, and he told me about, this was years ago when I was a kid, about when London was under the barrage of the German V2 rockets, how the people in London pulled together, how that united people. It's kind of an eye-opener when you speak to it, that this is a common trait that you find across different cultures, regardless of where you've gone. And obviously you've been, how many, I think you said 30 different deployments around the world. It's amazing. So
the thing I wanted to say where it brings humility is that I think it's important things to clarify. We have the perception in our rich developed countries that it is we humanitarian workers and all, it's a lot, it's many NGOs. I've been in Haiti during the earthquake. It was 700 international NGOs that came and tried to help. So there is this perception that it's we that are coming to save these people and to help them. It's or the concept of the white savior, to put it in a broader picture. I've always been amazed. We are coming and we are helping, but the first reaction is coming from the people themselves, from the community. It's quite amazing what people can do in such a situation. In the end, I wouldn't say that what we do today, for example, in Turkey and Turkey and Syria related to the earthquake is a drop in the ocean, but kind of. Compared to everything that the community are dealing with and the way they organize themselves to survive, we're just a tiny percentage of that. So again, that brings the humility a little bit, personally, but also for us as a humanitarian organization. Yeah.
That sounds like something that shaped you when you've been in these zones, and it's raw and it's elemental and it's unfiltered. You truly see the core values that these kind of maelstroms bring out of people. It comes to the forefront whenever everything else seems vacuous and abstract. That just burns away, and then you actually see what the core, the center of what human beings are, regardless of race, creed, or religion, or whatever. So I find that kind of fascinating.
And then
yes, please.
If I may, because it rings a bell that sometimes the way to help the people is not the way you think. So again, back to Libya, but I've done that in other contexts. There was such a pride in defending themselves against the invader or the oppressor at the time. What they needed in the first week where we arrived, medically speaking, they had the capacity to take care of their own patient. However, Libya was at peace before, so doctors, nurses, surgeons had operated at quite a very good level of health quality, but they had never seen such an amount of trauma, wounded people by explosive, by explosion, by bullets. And so when we arrived, doctors had been working night and days for a week or two without sleeping. And what they needed was not, maybe they needed a bit of drugs, they were about to run out of drugs, but they needed mental health support. The doctors were traumatized. Literally, they were exhausted physically, mentally. So one of our first projects when we opened in Misrata was to provide psychological support to the doctors and the nurses on how to deal with the abundance of blood and flesh and that they had never experienced before. That was also for me quite interesting. So sometimes, it's not the help thing; it's just helping people to cope. And they were managing, I would say, what they were doing for protecting themselves. But mental health was key for them to go through this.
I mean, at that level, I've worked with trauma, but not to the carnage these doctors and nurses and medical professionals seen. Nowhere near that kind of carnage. What did the mental health professionals do to help these doctors and nurses process this?
First, I have to say the challenge was to find mental health professional in that context, speaking the language and knowing the culture. But that we managed, and that also psychological support in many contexts, like it is in Norway or in France, is still taboo to go and see and talk to. So that we managed. But after that, I think in an intense situation like a war zone, it was just allowing them to pause, have a break, and have a safe space. And allow them just to vent and completely like blurb their tiredness, their frustration, because they were literally. I mean, when I was there, the bombing was. I saw even some rockets passing over my own head. So it was intense from morning to evening, and you had the rockets coming from the opposing troops, and you had NATO also at the time using massive missile. You could hear them falling 5 kilometers ahead, and you could feel the blast 5 kilometers away, and that in an intensity that you're not allowed to, and then of course wounded people coming constantly. So psychological support at the time was just offering them a tiny window to breathe, to have that space, and how can I measure today and say that this has been a critical support to them? I don't know. It felt like they appreciated it. We didn't impose it on them. They really told us our doctors are tired physically and mentally. What can we do? As much as it could help. One thing that was also very much, they told it is like, we were one of the few, we were the only one at the time, medical organization to be there. So to be there, as Doctors Without Borders, with them inside that city, completely surrounded, was giving them hope. They felt supported also. To feel heard, to feel listened, to feel seen. That context, I don't know why we're insisting on that one. It's maybe me bringing it because it was an extreme one, but that's also something that helped them to, I would say,
process, and deal with it. When you said a safe space, I mean, can you elaborate on that? So where the doctors and the nurses and the medical professionals or first responders had a safe space, could you sort of elaborate on how that safe space shows up?
I think in that case was just, it was just breaking from their routine, and their routine was sleeping in the corridor of an hospital and 1 hour and then just or two before the next wave of wounded people would come in. So just maybe take them out of the hospital if it was possible, and make sure they could just speak, and just because I think that definitely in intense situation like that, people just you're resilient, you're protecting yourself, you do your job, but you don't allow yourself for just even crying, even for yawning. You barely allow yourself to eat or drink, because you're driven by your purpose. In that case, they were defending themselves. So it's just to allow them for a break. Now, the safe space is created by the psychologist, and it can be about, as I said, going out of the hospital for just a couple of hours, not too far, because they wouldn't go too far, afraid of more patients would come, and then there would be, so take them in a different location, close enough, build a trust with them. I think psychosocial support and psychology was, it was a taboo at the time in Libya. So it took a bit of time, I think, but I think after that they appreciated it. So I don't know if I'm describing it well, but again, with the confidentiality, with having psychologists speaking the language, knowing the culture and the environment, just to allow to,
And I think that's a very important thing, because you can't just pull any psychologist in. They need to understand the culture, their perspectives, their values, however that shows up based on religion or culture or ethnicity, what have you. But I think also what you said, it's the ability to speak their language. And I think that's so important, because when it comes down to, I work as a coach and things. It's nowhere near what these psychologists do, of course not. But when I'm talking to Swedes or Norwegians about their challenges, a lot of it's corporate challenges, and it really hits with them emotionally. Of course, it's always easier for them to speak Norwegian, Swedish, so we switch over to those languages, right? If it's day to day, then English is okay. But it's exactly that. we want to go back to the language that comes natural to us. And I think that's a very, very important element to bring into that, to create that safe space.
Exactly. So we were having psychologists coming from different places in the world, but they were not doing the clinical work directly. They were putting in place the program and identifying the psychologists in the place that could do the work, and supporting the psychologists also who were not themselves used to deal with that kind of situation. Again, Libya had been at peace for a long period of time. So that's very often what we do. Yeah, we did the same, by the way. It reminds me of something. We did the same in China. I was in there. There was a massive earthquake in Chengdu, I think it was 2008 or 2009. Mental health was also a major part of our activity there, and not for us to do the psychological, clinical work with medical staff or patient, but it was just to put in place the program and support the national, local psychologists on how to do the work.
I was just wondering, this is maybe a little side issue. Like in the West, there is a huge, we have some of the best schools in the world that train psychologists, psychiatrists, and clinicians and such. Is there, again, forgive my place of ignorance here, but in some of these countries that you've been through, in Somalia and Libya, do they have trained professionals, or do you have to bring external professionals who speak the language? Do they have these? Is there a huge focus in these countries?
In most cases, they do.
Okay.
They do, but the level of practice is different. I think the perception of going to a psychologist is very different. An example, I just mentioned China, but then in China, we brought some of our colleagues from Southeast Asia, from Indonesia, because we had work during the earthquake with some psychologists. So we knew these people, we knew they were good. They were not Chinese, they were Indonesian. And again, they just came to meet their counterparts in another country and help them on how to support their own national patients. So I think it's there are exceptions. South Sudan, youngest nation in our planet now, in a conflict for many years, the amount of professional, medical, paramedical psychologists is close to zero. Somali is very similar. So in some cases, we do have to find the people from outside with enough knowledge in the particular job. If it's psychologists, we need to bring them, definitely. But in many other places, they are professionals. They are professionals. That there's no doubt. We just need to find them and support them. But they're better than us. Then again, they know their context, they know their people, the language, the culture, and how to deal with it.
At the end of the day, it's being able to talk to someone you can relate to at whatever level to create that safe space. Yeah. You, as you said, you spent many years in different war zones and tragedies and natural disaster zones. And then you mentioned earlier in our conversation where you tired mentally. I was wondering, is that sort of being exhausted mentally with it, did part of that become compassion fatigue, or that wasn't part of it?
No, that was part of it, and that's how we call it. And we're doing some research in MSF on it. And there's been we have a few projects ongoing on that. Yeah, compassion fatigue, definitely.
It was definitely compassion fatigue. Yeah.
Yeah. No. It was. I think they were both physically. Like I said, 1 year I traveled 7 times. There is a fatigue of traveling. Somehow, there is a limit on how much we can absorb and understand. And then by traveling so much, I was actually, forgetting myself, clearly. I was not having enough time on my own, enough resting time, or most of what I would see and hear was pain or suffering. So clearly compassion. Yeah.
Because that's one of the things I used to work with, with first responders and such, when they felt compassion fatigue, and it was just they just closed down. It just became the problem to fix. And I felt that myself working for it. And that's why I actually got out of the game and went into the corporate life, because I just started seeing patients as problems to fix, and that's not a good place to be. For some people who've never experienced compassion fatigue, could you explain what you went through and how it showed up to you sort of emotionally or mentally, Alan?
I think in my case, what happened is my last two assignments, that's why maybe I mentioned them, was Mogadishu and Libya, who at the time were quite highly insecure context. I think it came close because a month after I left Mogadishu, two of my colleagues were shot dead by one of our staff. And of course, and I knew the killer, and these two guys were killed with two very close friends. So you start to say, "Am I next? Is it on my next assignment? Is it me?" I've been on a deployment also in Ebola. These are tough missions because these disease. We treat a lot of disease in the world and in our project, but Ebola, depending on the type of Ebola, there are 5 to 6 different ones. There's no treatment. Your chances to die is 90% of the people will most likely die. So that's the same. After an Ebola, I really it was a great mission. We did a great job. I was like, "Whoa, that was close." So that's the same. You start to compassion fatigue is first you're driven by what you think, what you can do for the others, until you're so tired that you start to think, "Oh, maybe I'm next." Libya was the same. I met some interesting people in Libya. I met some journalists on the front line, Marin Colvin, who was later killed in Syria. Technically, they were with a group of journalists and they got bombed by the Assad regime. And I knew these people. I met them on the front line. So there was an accumulation of things where it was starting to be difficult for me to, literally, am I next? What? So that's the way I kind of experienced it, where I started to say, am I taking too much risk? I never questioned myself, was it worse to do it, to be in this place and to assist the population as much as we could? But I just think it's like everything else. At some point we get tired. When you run a marathon, at the end of the marathon, you're tired and you're going to take a break before you run the next one.
Yeah, sure. That's very
so
true.
I don't know if I describe, I never reflected on it. As I said, we have some ongoing project. We're trying to study it and to better support our employees. So for me, it was just tiredness. Yeah.
Maybe you haven't come with the conclusions of your study yet, but what have you found so far?
Yeah, what we're looking at is because our population, our workforce is made of different people. It's about 62,000 people within 2021. The compassion fatigue will be different for the medical people, for example, than those who work for logistic and HR finance. So we're still. What we're learning mostly is we have to be careful. We have to take care, to take more care of our people and protect them as much as possible. That's the thing we're learning. We need to raise the awareness that it is a fact, and then the consequences. One of them can be burnout, and another consequence that people will stop and they will leave MSF. So I think that awareness is growing now, and after that is to take better care, to better take care of our employees. We started already a few years ago because we now have quite a lot of psychologists working in the field for our patient, for our employee. Same here in Norway, we have a psychologist, and she's going to brief people. She's going to support them during their deployment if they need. They know they can call that person. When they come back, they also have a debrief. It's not a clinical session, but they have a debrief. And if there's need for clinical support, then they will have it. I used it myself. So when I took my break, I'm still on a break from the field in 2000. I felt the need for that. Of that compassion fatigue, and where am I and what shall I do next? So I went to see the psychologist supported by MSF, and it was helpful. It was just a couple of conversations just to check in and then to move on.
Can you speak more about the debrief and how it works and what happens in these sessions?
during the debrief?
Yeah, like to operationally define, what is a debrief? Obviously, it's where you get to vent and talk through your thoughts, but I was wondering maybe you could speak to more of your experience of a debrief. As you said, it's not a clinical setting per se, but it's a place where you can talk to a professional about, sort of cleaning house, what's upstairs in your head. Could you speak more to how you experienced the debrief and how it helped you?
I think my colleagues, psychologists, doing the debrief, they're good. They just want to check on you if any of what you have experienced has been difficult or not, and if it's been difficult, how you manage to deal with it, and or if you're still struggling to manage with that, and if there's potential trauma. And then will come an external clinical support. I think it's just the feedback I have from most of my colleagues. They really like it. They see that as an organization that take care for them, that give them that, again, a safe space, confidential, and then just they feel seen, I think, by the organization.
Yeah.
It takes some time. It has a cost, but I think now we're investing more and more into that in Doctors Without Borders. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like I'm not responding to your question.
No. I mean, you've touched based on it, because it's sometimes hard to reflect on that, because when you're doing a debrief or you're the person who is debriefing, you're so wrapped up in the story and venting that we don't always recall all the elements in it, because you're so subjective in the storytelling. So a debrief, when I've done it, it's been so important, because the idea is to just ask questions and get a person to vent. Because when they're talking, Alan, it's not always coherent, logical thoughts that are strung together. Basically is the person's thinking out loud, and it's a lot of associative thoughts. So it feels like they're jumping from one spot to another, but that's the part of processing mental and emotions. And it's just that it doesn't have to be a clinical setting. It's just you're talking to someone who is present, who is listening, who sees you. And again, it comes back to what you were talking about, a safe space. And so it's just through that debrief of talking through things, talking about your emotions, exploring those emotions and exploring the thoughts, that we move from a subjective storyteller to the objective reader of that story, right? And all of a sudden we start processing it, and all the emotions and thoughts, again, if it's trauma, that's a different thing. Then you have to bring it to a different level. But even in a business setting or a school setting or family setting or whatever setting, just to talk through things, and not people always suggesting, oh, do this, but just being listened and seen. That helps people to process the emotions, and then they can sort of move on, because it allows them, again, from my experience of debriefing, to make sense of what's happened. So they can't change the situation, but the debrief sometimes helps them to shift perceptions from victim to victor, or from not feeling a sense of agency to having a sense of agency or autonomy over the situation. So I just wanted to explore that, because I think it's such a salient point you've made about debriefs.
It is, but remember, it's a first step, because the way we do it here in Norway or in other of our offices is the debrief will be very often, I would say, in the following days or following week or weeks, maximum 2 weeks after you return from a deployment. So it's still kind of warm, it's still kind of intense. And our experience in MSF, and we've been working on it about the insurance, and I'll really explain why. So that's very important, the debrief. But that said, what we notice by experience is if people really have some trauma or need for some support, it will take more time to surface. So helping them with the debrief is just to help them to vent, to kind of process things in a very specific time. But we're aware that most of our colleagues, it's a minority lucky, but starts to have some issues, it will come after 2 or 3 months. And I mentioned the insurance because before, the insurance system we had would cover basically for a couple of months after only. And now we're working on that so that the insurance is lasting longer, because every mental health related issue or resilience issue will come out in a much longer scope after that. And we want still to be present with our colleagues and staff, even if it's after 3 or 4 months. If they have to deal with some issue related to their deployment 3 to 4 months before that, then we should still be present for them. Yeah. So no, it's an important step. But both the briefing, it starts before when we recruit people, when we onboard them to be deployed. We also brief them. We try to prepare them as much as possible that yes, they will be challenged. They will be out of their comfort zone. We tell them they have the opportunity to call a psychological support or a mentor or a coach. Then we are available during the deployment, and so it's taking care in the whole process. And we were not doing that 20 years ago, literally not. Now we have to do it, and we're doing it. Yeah.
Alan has over 30 deployments under his belt over the years, and that took him to war zones, outbreaks of Ebola, disaster zones. In all of those situations, he saw how humanity, regardless of culture or country, how they pulled together. And that when people are in survival mode, people forget about their petty squabbles and vacuous values. What it truly does, what the common disaster, what the common confrontation, what the common enemy does, it pulls people together to support, to collaborate, and to help each other. And another point that really struck home to me talking to Alan was, these doctors and these nurses in the front line, how they had to process the carnage of warfare and the damage it does to the human body. None of them had ever experienced it to that extent. And what was important was to create that safe space where these professionals could vent and breathe. They could work through and process their emotions and their thoughts. And MSF, Doctors Without Borders, being there in the confrontation, in the disaster. And as Alan said, those doctors and nurses, they felt support, giving them hope that there were others out there, that they felt heard, they felt listened to, and they felt seen. And although many of us will never experience such extremes, we can take the lessons there and to bring it into our organizations, into our lives, into our spheres of influence, because we can learn from those extremes and how important psychological safety is, psychological soundness is. And that is to be seen, to be listened to be heard, to feel connected to the community, to the group, to the team. And the other lesson, the other side of that coin, is about self-compassion. It's about self-care. It's the ability to understand that although we give and show empathy and we help others, we need to turn those skills onto ourselves. Otherwise, we experience compassion fatigue, where we can burn out, where we can hit the wall, where we just can't seem to process the next problem, to help the next person. As Alan said, you start out thinking, what can I do to help others? Until you are so tired, you start to think, am I next? Am I the next one to fall? From your HR perspective, how is it now? As you said, you may not directly support, but what is it like to be in the HR role for MSF? Understanding that there are people out in the field there, in danger zones.
But it's to make sure that we clearly fulfill our duty of care. Mm-hmm. So technically, it's everything I mentioned before to make sure that process of onboarding, briefing people to make sure this is happening. That's one of the key that I'm trying to do. That our people, when they are being deployed, they don't need to be in a war zone. You can be in Malawi. You can be in the where should I say? We have projects today in Brazil or in many other places which are quite safe. Even though we as an employer and we as HR, we need to make sure that our people, whatever they need, they feel supported. And sometimes it's not mental health they need some help because they have an issue in their family, there is some administrative issue. So here again, from an HR perspective, is to make sure that we take care of them, whatever they need, I would say. And that's kind of demanding. Now we have, I think MSF Norway now, we have 30 Norwegian/Icelandic deployed. We send about 100 people every year. So you need to make sure behind you have the team that will take care of those people who are being deployed abroad. One last thing we did, because we identified this as a need, we have prepared with some external expert in Norway, a specific training called Psychological First Aid Kit. And this training has been done for all of our HR team here in Norway. they're not coach, they're not psychologists, and we don't want them to be, but to train them. So it's a different sets of workshop to develop their awareness on their listening skills, on how to detect things, on how to listen to people, how to talk to people, so that they will react better. So I'm quite happy that we've done it. It's not finished, the first session, and I think we're going to expand it. So again, as an HR, it's giving the tool to my team in HR to take care better of our people being deployed abroad. That's where we are now, basically.
And I think from your perspective, I just wanted to say this because you are a man who has experience in 30 plus deployments in all different types of scenarios. And I think having someone who has the experience can then, I think they're better qualified to vet what is needed. Because when you've experienced almost burnout or compassion fatigue or just mental fatigue in general, then you understand. Because as you said, you've been through a process of debriefing or talking to psychologists or mental health experts. So you actually understand from your perspective. So it's not so much theoretical knowledge as it is practical knowledge. It's experience knowledge and not versus book knowledge. I think that is so important when you're talking about the mental health perspective or the psychological safety of people, that you come from a place of experience and not from, a place of just theoretical textbooks. So I just want to make that point because for me, that is so super salient to parse those two different experiences. I mean, they talk about the same thing, but when someone's talking from experience and they themselves have gone through, there's so much more credibility and so much more tangibility to it, because then that becomes the roots that help other people. And hopefully they don't have to go through that level of compassion fatigue or hitting the wall. I just wanted to make that point because I think that's so salient, such an astute point to make, that little difference there, or big difference actually.
No, thanks for making the point. And that said, it made me smile, and it made me think that you're never too resilient, or you're never resilient enough. Why? Because so I think I had one burnout when I was in the field out of all this year in being deployed. But it happened to me again end of 2022, and I barely saw it coming, and I was out for 2 or 3 months. And then it took me 2 or 3 months to came at full capacity. So end of 2021 and early 22. So I was just like, and that has impacted me a lot. It was a combination of different factors, work. And I would say easy to put it on COVID, but indeed 2021 have been difficult year for everyone, especially for HR, trying to support our employee here in Norway, in all our offices and abroad. So it's kind of a... Speaking of experience, and now I think I would have, I shouldn't say I would, I have even more focus on I'm preparing a new statement on health and well-being for MSF Norway, because I don't want to be there, and I don't want to see more of my colleagues struggling with mental health or well-being. So, yeah.
No, I mean, for organizations, I've talked to many HR professionals since I started this podcast. And when you look at the organizations, they are almost the first responders. They're the ones that had to scramble because there was no precedent for this. And they had to scramble to figure out, to think about the well-being and the mental health and, I don't know, so many variables. It's so complicated. And that working, coaching with HR professionals, I've heard the stories and the strategies and the skills, that the burdens that they've had to carry, right? Even though they may have worked a 10, 12-hour day, their brains didn't shut off. It was still revolving around their heads, and it affected their sleep and their quality of life, literally, at every level.
And I think for me, there was a level of, to go back to what you mentioned, there was a level of compassion fatigue, because what we noticed in the last years of 20 and 21, we had to push the boundaries on how much we were making ourselves available to listen to people who were struggling. Many people were struggling. In our organization, it was the youngest who had lost references, who were much more struggling with the lockdown and different new ways of working, hybrid. So it was a stretch to spend even more time to listen to colleagues, just to do that. So I'm not saying, I don't know if it was compassion fatigue, but in the end I was tired myself. Going home, and then you have to listen to your kids, of course, or to your partner, and then just you can't because you've been doing like the whole day.
That is compassion fatigue, because at some point you just have to shut down. Because you need to recharge your mental batteries. It just is. We can only take so much cognitive load before we're running on fumes. And for me, I talk to many clients. It's not always something tragic. It could just be things, but emotions themselves are infectious and they sit with you. And people think I'm a little crazy for the long runs that I do. But for me, Alan, it's just a way for me to process, to process all those emotions and to process the things. And maybe sometimes socially, I'm not the most social guy, but I think there's a reason, because I understand what compassion fatigue is, and I don't want to go down that road anymore. And by spending time to reconnect with myself, and that sounds like that's what you did the last 2 or 3 months after your burnout. Is it slowly, again, enough with me, but back to you, but your 2 or 3 months to come back to full recovery, maybe we could speak to that. How did you recharge your mental batteries?
Yeah, well, I was lucky again because I had some psychosocial support. It was really helpful. I mean, that's where I think resilience is interesting. Is really key, and you mentioned it. Is the way you find that what works for yourself to recharge your batteries and to find energy again and to reflect. I don't know if this is what you said about running, but to me, it's running. So it really helped me to go through 2020. I think I ran many kilometers in 2020, but after that, it was just running, being on my own, and processing and just resting physically, I think, sleeping. It was a combination. I think it was really good to have a psychologist to talk to reflect on the way I was managing my emotion. Definitely. After, for me, it's been running. And not running on asphalt. I will make jokes on that. I like to run. I feel lucky to live in Norway. We have amazing landscape, amazing forest with lots of wild animals out there. Well, not that wild, but it's just to be out there and breathe. I think maybe it's linked to the breathing.
It definitely is. It definitely is.
Yeah. So a combination of course, stopping to work, stopping to think about work. Maybe there was some compassion fatigue. Exercising, more sleep. But again, that works for me. I know people don't like to run, and they will do other things. They will be swimming. They will do yoga. They will do cross-country skiing in Norway. But for me, it's running. It's just to,
it's interesting because I was working with a client, and he's quite active, but he's scared of heights, and so he decided to learn to go rock climbing. And like not like indoor rock climbing like I do, but like really real climbing out on the cliff, right? And so he went up with a professional, a rock climber to teach him the ropes, literally to teach him the ropes. And so he was telling me he got up, I don't know, it was like a whatever 75 meters or something on a cliff face, right? And all of a sudden he looked down and he froze. And so his guide, he sort of rappelled down and says, "Hey, Gunnar, what's going on?" And so Gunnar goes, I'm stuck. And the guy goes, "Don't look down. Don't look up. Just focus on what's within 1 meter of you. And that's all you focus on." So again, this comes back down to the core tenets of, CBT or therapy in itself. Focus on what you control, where you have a sense of agency and autonomy, and where you can actually place action. And slowly but surely, he was just focusing on that 1 meter, click, 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 click. He got up and he felt such confidence. He hasn't been rock climbing again, but the point is, right, a lot of people go parachuting. They don't do it a second time, but he did it. And he learned something about himself. But in that small 2-minute conversation with a professional, it was just that focus on what you can control. Just 1 meter in front of you. Don't look down, don't up. And that's the same thing. Don't always look to the past, because the past is not a predictor of the future, right? If something terrible happened to you, and don't get lost in the future and worry about all the anxieties and such. Focus on what can you do in the here and now. And as you said, running makes you present. You're connected with the breathing, and that helps. And again, running is not for everyone, but that's something that works for you and works for me.
It's just at some point, it's time to be. And I'm not saying that because I work for Doctors Without Borders, but in any other profession, we tend to give it all to the work, to the colleagues, when we give it all to family and kids. It's just to become a bit more egoistic. Think about ourselves and taking care of ourselves. So for me, running is, yes, it's to be healthy. I'm getting older, but it's more or less doing what I like. I don't run with an objective to be a performer at my age. It's just because I like it. It's fun. It's just the intensity of it. Sometimes I run we're a group of trail runners here where I live. So it's just fun. It's just doing something, having a break. And of course, running gives you a shot of, what is it, adrenaline or endorphin, all of that. So you're
all of it.
Better.
Serotonin, dopamine, the whole thing. The brain's a great pharmacy.
Yeah, but exactly. It's just so yeah. It's good to be. I don't know if this is the word, to be egoistic a little bit, but taking care of ourselves. So that's the way. The other way that I like also is, and I'm going to do that next weekend, by the way, not this weekend, next weekend. I need to be on my own. That's also one thing. I know other friends, they need to go out, they need to drink, they need to have parties, they need to go to cinema or to concert. Me, I need to be on my own for 3 or 4 days. Just and I'm lucky I can use the cabin of a friend. And it's at the seaside, and I just do nothing, and I sleep, and I read, and it's just my bubble. And I don't do that every month. I might do that 2 or 3 times a year, but I know in advance when I need to do it, and I know I need to do that. I need to take that time for me.
So this is not egotistical. For me, this falls under the umbrella of self-care and self-compassion, because, I'd say a lot of people I work with are very caring and think about others, a lot of altruistic behavior. And I always say it's like being a rich person. You can keep giving to charities and keep giving money to people who need it, but unless you fill up your bank account, you become the charity case at some point. You become the head case at some point, right? And so what you're saying, I don't think is egotistical. I think it's about self-care. By taking care of yourself, you can take care of the people in your organization, your family, your friends, what have you. And so I think it comes back down with what we're saying. It's to avoid burnout, compassion fatigue, hitting the wall, however you want to characterize it, and to find that mental space for us to recharge. Because at the end of the day, that's what we need to show up at the game, is when we feel that we stand on cognitive and emotional firm ground. That's what I truly believe from my experience over doing this for 25 years. I was wondering... No,
you're doing right with self-care.
Sorry.
And I see it from back to the HR, because that's a discussion we're having here in MSF Norway, but also I'm part of an CHRO network. Self-care is a key word, but it's not that easy, because I'm clarifying for all my colleagues that there is self-care and there is the care that we must take responsibility as an employer. I think maybe it took me some years and experience and building my resilience to find what self-care means for me. And that said, I had that burnout 1 year ago. So you see, it's never. But how to help people to find what is good for them and what they like and have this self-care. That's something I'm still looking for, because I heard lately some colleagues, and they were basically telling me, well, I'm not really good at that. I don't really know how to do it. And if my employer or if the organization can help me to define that framework for me and push me out of work, or that's a weird concept, to be honest. That's a weird concept. So it's just, there's a lot from an HR perspective or organization on how to help people to find to have that self-care. I don't know if it's something current with the new society where people will live in an abundance of things, abundance of digital, abundance of social media, where people are, I feel like, even myself, I feel like I kind of maybe at some point struggle to find what meant self-care for me. So I don't know. I'm more question than answers. Yeah,
maybe I can add a little, just from my experience. Again, it's anecdotal. Organizations, when I get hired for an organization, it may be for a performance issue or communication issue, but a lot of the times, 80% of the times, it's just saying this particular person just needs a sparring partner. He or she's one of our best, or this is someone we want to develop, blah, blah, blah. But it's just having that. I think it comes back down to that safe space, having an arena where you can share your thoughts, someone who's not friend, who's not a family, who's not colleague, but it's this third road in which you can build a trusting relationship with, and you can vent, you can work through things. And it's through that discussion, because this person's there. I'm there just listening and questioning, and I'm present. And my job is to help push that person in a direction that they want to go, but try to help them bring down the hurdles. And it's through there, they find their own unique, bespoke, tailored way of self-care or self-compassion. If we could just use those words right now, that vernacular, just to find those words and help them to define it. And then that external sparring partner, he or she becomes the external commitment. Because sometimes when we say, oh, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, we can renege on ourselves. We can just say, oh, I'll do it tomorrow. We can procrastinate. But when your credibility is based on something you said to someone else externally, and you know you're going to follow up with that person 2 weeks from now, it definitely raises the bar of actually fulfilling what you're going to say. And what you see is a trend where a person takes care of themselves, right? They are there still for their colleagues and their friends and the family, but it's a much more integrated approach. Now it's also, they are the element too, right? That's just my anecdotal thing from my experience that helps people to find that self-care. But sometimes you just need a space where that's where the conversation is about, nothing else. It's about you and how to take care of you.
Well, that makes me think back to what I did before in MSF, when we decided to create mentoring support for MSF. The main objective for team leaders was to have a mentor they could reflect. And the main objective was really leadership. We wanted to have better leaders and better managers. So anyway, I had a pilot phase, the project increased. But one key thing is we made a research and a partnership with a university and some professors in the UK. And the result came out after 2 years. And one of the main impacts of mentoring, which was a surprise for me, because it was not an objective, was well-being. We're trying to prove that mentoring was there to help leaders to become better leaders. And that the first impact out of 3 was people felt better, that the mentor helped them to some element were on self-care, but also to reflect, to listen, and so on. So it's just to reflect on what you just said.
But I mean, the whole idea of reflecting on an experience you've had, good or bad, if we just categorize it as an experience, right? Because we can learn from successes and we can learn from mishaps or whatever. But just reflecting on what you said, Alan, I think is such a salient point, because it's through that reflecting that we become more resilient. Because what is resilience? It's about understanding what we've been through, good or bad, and then learning how to adapt for the next time something similar. Obviously, it's not going to be exactly, but when similar situations, okay, this is what I can do. This is how I made it through this time. And I think back to what you said, if people go through burnout or compassion fatigue, when I've talked to clients helping them through burnout or dealing with crashing into the wall, a lot of them, I'd say 90% of them say it was one of the best things that ever happened to them, because it became a wake-up call. It allowed them to learn from the experience, to know when that creeping feeling is coming back. It becomes a red flag, a warning sign, to see those early signs, to be much more cognizant to them, and to shift into, let's say, what we've just talked about, self-care, to minimize that. And I think that's what I hear from you. Sometimes you can feel it coming on and you're thinking, okay, I need 3 days by myself in a cabin by the seaside where it's just me. Is that what I understand you were saying? Because that's what it sounded like.
No, definitely. Definitely, because you don't want to be, I don't want to be a victim of what happens to me. I want to make sure I take my responsibility in general. So I want to understand and take ownership, take responsibility, and then make sure it's not. But yeah, no, it's going into the definition of resilience that you gave. But again, I'm still trying to be careful, because I'm going to find out if I'm resilient in the next crisis. Basically, is that You see my point, that
Yes.
I have all my learnings, and I'm building up on mechanism that help me to improve self-care, and then improve self-care of my friends or my colleagues. But I'm still, I don't know, I'm still careful. I'm just because, it's I don't know what resilience is never given, or is never for forever in that sense. But for me, it's just positive. It's been a transition last year. Every of this experience, like you said, is just bringing you beyond something. And it's just, you never know what you can. I don't know what will be the next crisis in my life. Will it be something happening at work or in Doctors Without Borders, or my health is good today? Am I resilient tomorrow if I find out I have a cancer? See my point? It's just
Yeah.
I know I'm taking it to a different level now, but it's just, I just want to be humble about my own resilience, because I just think it's never given always, and it's just that's how it is. That's life, basically. Yeah.
Well, I think it's just that resilience shows up in different ways, and with the skills that we learn becomes a toolbox. But sometimes those tools are not always going to help us fix the challenge that we're facing right now. Because maybe I put a hammer in the toolbox and I actually need a screwdriver, but somehow I have to use the hammer. It will work, but it's not efficient. But it's through that process that, okay, next time I know I need a screwdriver or a spanner or what have you, right? So yes, resilience is a work in progress. You don't become bulletproof. You don't become Superman or Superwoman. That's a joke, right? But you do become.
Thanks for using that word. Thanks for using these words. That's what I wanted to say exactly.
Okay. Well, I think we're on the same page, the same sentence, Alan. I'm respectful of your time, Alan. I was wondering, just as we close this conversation, and I hope to have continue this conversation at a later date with you, because I think there's so much more here to talk about.
Yeah, sure.
But is there any advice or words of wisdom you could share with our listeners when it comes to resilience from your experience, what they can do to meet challenges, to meet adversity?
Resilience, to start with this word, is a conversation with ourselves. I think that's what we've been talking about today. And I think sometimes we need guidance for such conversations. So as you said, we're clearly not Superman, and we will never be. So I think to believe that we can find out on our own, sometimes we can. But what has been helpful in my experience, and I was lucky MSF supported me, Doctors Without Borders, but I've done it also on my own initiative with my own money. It was to reach out to people, to have that kind of guidance. And that, I think sometimes it's the most difficult to make that step. I didn't go for a full psychoanalysis I was just trying to get that. If not that, it could be mentors or a coach. I'm doing this now. I mean, when I took my role as an HR director for MSF Norway, I wanted from the beginning, I wanted to have a mentor, but I did not want to have a mentor from MSF. I wanted to have a mentor, a formal one. So I that's one of the reasons out of many that I try to reach out to the networks of my peers here in Norway and also in Scandinavia. And by the time I identified few people, it's not formal mentor relationship. It's people that we are developing a trust relationship. We are peers. It's equal mentors. We can mentor each other. We discuss, and we can challenge each other. But that's what is helpful, is to have. You mentioned that word before, the sparring partner. I think that's the. Sometimes some of us could do that with their partner physically. Husband or wife or whatever, or a close friend. In my case, I need to relate and to find someone that I can reflect and have this mirror on that. So I think my advice is that in some situation, maybe it's funny, going back to what we discussed, when I was in the field as a humanitarian worker, I didn't have a choice. And we didn't have mentors and coaches at the time. So I think I had enough strength to kind of process things and reflect. But it would have been great to have a mentor or a coach. Today, what I'm doing is I'm proactively, I'm aware I need that guidance. I need people to reflect with, to have a mirror with. And that's, I think that would be my best advice. So I don't know what would work for each of us or each of you. As I said, it can be a very good friend, a high level of trust, you will not expect solutions or whatsoever, but someone you can just have a reflection and a safe space again. Can be a psychologist, can be a coach, can be a mentor, whatever works for you. But there are moments in life where we need that. We need that. And sometimes it's not just one person, it's different. I had the luck once, I had a coach and a mentor. It was brilliant because maybe some of you know, but they used different techniques, and It was good to have the coach perspective, the mentor perspective. That was brilliant. I feel lucky at that time.
Thanks very much, Alan. I really appreciate it. I think that's a very valuable tip that many of our listeners can walk away with and take away with, and may themselves have already experienced. But Alan, I appreciate your time, and I'm very grateful for this conversation. I've learned a lot. It was very grounded and very real for me, and a lot of what you said really hit home to me because I've experienced some of the things you've talked about when it comes to self-care, resilience, mental welfare, compassion fatigue. So thank you for your time.
Thanks a lot, Lisa. It was a pleasure to discuss and have this conversation with you.
Well, folks, that was Alan Lefevre. He is the HR director for Doctors Without Borders here in Norway. And a big personal thank you to you, Alan. I am very grateful for your time that you dedicated to the conversation today. It was a brilliant conversation, and we talked about a lot of hard subjects. And it awoke in me that feeling that I had many years ago of compassion fatigue. And I don't regret that compassion fatigue. For me, it is something that becomes a warning light. It becomes an alarm clock to check in with myself. And Alan's own stories of struggle with burnout and compassion fatigue, well, it is an alarm clock. It is a wake-up call for us. It's a reminder for us to take care of ourselves, to turn self-compassion and self-care onto ourselves as much as we do to others. And when we do, well, we show up in our best selves for other people, to support and to help other people. And so thank you again very much, Alan, for sharing your stories and skills and your experiences with us. If any of you would like to reach out to Alan or to Doctors Without Borders, I will leave all the contact information in the show notes. And a personal shout out to Alva. Thank you, Alva, for putting me into contact with Alan. He's a great guy, and I had a brilliant conversation. Well, dear listeners, that brings us to a tail end of another episode. And if I could trouble you to just take a couple of minutes out of your day to rate the episode and give me some feedback, that would be brilliant. And if you could also recommend this podcast to 2 family members, 2 colleagues, and 2 friends, you'd also be doing me a big favor. Until next week, folks, until the next time we converse, keep well, keep strong, and we'll speak soon.